Good happy overnight all, and welcome on in from day 1, episode 50.3. As always, let's grab the mailbag just for any particular, well, guess we don't need to finish that statement. Items that were there. We'll get right underway with tonight's part 2 of Steven Greer, Extraterrestrial Extraordinaire. This would be from September 17th, 2013. The precursor to Midnight in the Desert, the SiriusXM show Dark Matter.
This is Dark Matter with Art Bell. To call Art, please light up the lines at 1-855-REAL-UFO. That's 1-855-732-5836.
Okay, not yet. Do not call yet. Hang in there. We've got him busied out. We'll let you know. Dr. Greer rarely takes calls, and I doubt he will tonight, but that's all right. If we have time left, we'll do unscreened open lines. Listen, there is a way for you to get to me, and we call it the wormhole. If you'll go to artbell.com, the website run by the esteemed Keith Rowland, you'll find the wormhole. In fact, we were going to talk to Keith about putting that on the front page. He might have already done it. I don't know, but I know a lot of you are going over there and trying to find it. The wormhole is a place where you send in text. You type text. It goes in Arizona, and it comes out on the other side, other dimension literally, here in Nevada near 51. So the wormhole, that's a way to ask Dr. Greer a message or make a comment to me or whatever it is you would like to do. In the meantime, welcome back, Dr. Steven Greer. I want to describe something to you, Doctor, and it's the truth. And you tell me what I've got. I've got an antenna here that I've had for years and years, and it's got a kind of a bunch of interesting stuff about it. For example, it covers 5 acres. It's called a double loop antenna, and it covers 5 acres. The high point is about 100 feet. The lowest it gets is about 76 feet. Now, here's what's special about this antenna. Number one, it creates its own voltage. It creates extremely high voltage, right. And even nice, beautiful blue skies, no wind, nothing. It creates enough voltage, Doctor, to knock you right on your butt.
Sure.
And I have no idea where it comes from. Now, it's not a great deal of current, but it is a great deal of voltage and enough current to knock you on your butt. So we're talking about something. For years and years and years, I've wondered what it is we're talking about, and I don't know why that voltage is there, but when you close it and put it to ground, you get a nice, long, blue spark. What is all that? Yeah,
well,
what is that?
Part of it is that there's an electromagnetic potential associated with the Earth, that there's a certain degree at the level of the ground, and there's a certain amount as you go upward, even several meters. In fact, that's why loggers will have to have a ground cable when they're scaling a very, very tall tree in the Pacific Northwest, or they can get shocked. So there is a known voltage delta or differential between the ground and as you go upward into the sky, even a few meters, and certainly 100 feet or more. And that is a well-known phenomenon. And can it be harnessed? Yes, it could be. In fact, there are people who discussed how perhaps Nikola Tesla had experimented with some of these unusual antennas and were pulling energy out of this phenomenon. Now, that's, I think, different from what I'm talking about in terms of the quantum vacuum, or the so-called zero-point energy field. That is the energy.
Can you explain that? What is zero-point energy? What is it?
Okay, that's the energy that's left in any volume of space if you were to cool everything down to absolute zero, minus 273, whatever it is, absolute, where all atomic movement stops, everything stops. There's still an energy potential there, and this has been proven in physics, and as I mentioned, the Casimir effect. What people don't understand, however, is that for over 100 years, scientists such as Faraday, Nikola Tesla, others in experimenting with high voltage systems, would create a phenomenon where they would tap into that energy that's in the quantum vacuum, and you would end up getting more energy out of, say, a generator than you have to put into it. Now, people say, oh, it's violating the laws of thermodynamics. I said, no, it isn't, because it's pulling energy out that you haven't been calculating is there, but has been proven to be there. So it's energy that's not in outer space. It's in any volume of space, and this is a huge amount of energy, and it's been reported, of course, that Nikola Tesla had an electric car running with an antenna on it, that it recharged itself, and this is true. And in fact, I've got an amazing document. It's on our website where when Nikola Tesla died, the FBI swooped in and confiscated all of his secret papers.
That's right.
And I have a document where the Department of Defense of the United States is demanding that the FBI turn over those files to them, and they wouldn't. And so, you have all these sort of fiefdoms within the government. But,
even to this very day, they won't turn it over.
Right. And so what's interesting about this is that the secrecy around the whole UFO and extraterrestrial issue has so much less to do with what most people would imagine than very ordinary things like power and money and oil and gas. And first of all, let's take a big step back. If you look at the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, okay, we had choo-choo trains, which were basically steam engines, and then you had, the early internal combustion cars that Mercedes had, and then, of course, Ford. So that's over 100 years old. Then you had electricity from burning coal, creating a steam turbine or hydroelectric. Jet engines, by the way, were the 30s. And rockets, of course, Wernher von Braun, who's chief spokesperson for the last few years of his life, is one of our Disclosure Project witnesses. Wernher von Braun, who was Adolf Hitler's rocket guy, who was inventing V-2 rockets dropping on London, that was the 40s, early 40s. So are we to really believe, and of course the atomic bomb was 1945 at the Trinity site there, are we really to believe that in 70-some years there had been no breakthroughs in fundamental physics of energy generation and propulsion? Well, that's just nonsense.
You're right. It's very, very hard to believe. There should have been many more breakthroughs in the energy field, and gee, can we sit here and imagine that A, there have been, and B, wonder why they just have sort of not drifted to the top?
Well, here's why. Well, there's a number of reasons why, and I want to get into this just a little bit. On our website at Sirius Disclosure, SIRIUS Disclosure, all one word.com, there's a document from the Federation of American Scientists. Now, since I've spoken to you last, this group of very prestigious scientists in Washington, D.C., came out with from their National Security Project, Stephen Aftergood put out a report, and it was 3 years ago next month in October that this came out. And so it's fairly recent, that there are 5,135 patents that have been seized under the National Security Act. Now, one of the things that they bring up, they don't really drill down on the whole zero-point question and anti-gravity question, but they do mention the fact that 40-some years ago in 1971, that there was a photovoltaic generator that was more efficient than 20% efficiency, which was unheard of back then, that would have basically competed with the price point for oil and coal. And it was seized under a national security order. Now, what justifiable reason could there be for the abuse of state power to seize someone's invention that was simply a very super efficient solar electric generator in 1971? This is the kind of abuse of power that has gotten us into this kind of mess that no one is talking about. Now, the Federation of American Scientists, which is not some conspiracy group or something, is a very mainstream group, brought this issue up and asked the question in this document, how could this really be justified under the National Security Act, and how many other wonderful technologies have met this demise? So that's one avenue of what I call suppression. The other avenue is before you even get to filing a patent, you get some goons who knock on your door. And I have a man who I had under contract a couple years ago who does a lot of work for the intelligence community and the contracting community, but he had been granted permission to work with us to bring out one of these so-called free energy generators. So, we provided a grant to him so he could do this in his spare time because he was still working full-time for...
I remember this. I remember.
All right. Now, this man knew how to build something similar to what you're discussing, but much more compact that you have out at your ranch in Nevada, where it would have basically been something you run your house on this electromagnetic potential. And we wanted to bring this out to sort of a demonstration proof of principle project. So sure enough, he starts working on this and assembling. He knows exactly what to do, by the way. This is someone who's not some wild-eyed inventor who knows nothing. This is a very ingenious inventor.
Okay.
And, about the time he gets rolling on this, a former CIA director and a bunch of goons show up at his skiff, his secure facility, and basically threaten him and his wife and tell him to stop working on it, and he does. And we're out the resources and funds we provided, and this guy runs with his tail between his legs.
All right.
So this kind of stuff, now this is something that in a court of law I can prove happened.
Okay, you had money. You had money invested, Doctor. You had money invested, right? I remember. Well, I remember when you raised that money. I remember. Now, since it got squashed and since he got threatened, I'm sure you have the exact details, don't you, of what was said to him and how it was done?
Oh, sure. And in fact, the people at the Naval Research Labs who brokered the relationship with this gentleman were appalled and shocked at how this was all played out. And
how did it play out? I'm asking you exactly how did it play out?
Well, after he was really making some progress on a deliverable date, he got a visit from a former CIA director who, ironically, had at one point become the chief counsel for Booz Allen Hamilton, the big contractor that Snowden worked for. And he went down there and basically, with some other folks, threatened this guy. And it said all kinds of things that scared him to the point of stopping doing this. And what I've concluded, here's the problem. The lone wolf approach, and this is all we've had resources to do. We're trying to raise more funds to create a stronger research effort now, is that we would provide, maybe $100,000 to some, a modest grant so that they could work on something and get something put together. But they're working by themselves, and they're out there as lone wolves who don't have any kind of tactical security. They don't have any kind of support system, and it's inherently risky. So I'm not going to ever do that again, frankly.
Did they actually threaten his life?
Oh, yes, and his wife. His life and his wife. Now, it's interesting because the man who first introduced me to him was a very senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs, which is the largest Department of Defense lab in the world, by the way. Thomas Edison founded it. It's interesting history. But he told me that he was involved in an operation where he had learned of some things where he was told point blank that if he were to discuss it publicly, they would kill him, his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. Now, this is not a conspiracy movie. This is someone who's at my home, who is a very senior scientist in the government. I mean, it's the highest civilian rank. And this is the kind of thuggish nonsense that does go on. And I think the public needs to know about it. The public needs to say, we're fed up with this foolishness.
Well, of course. I'm curious. Did this impress you to the point that I think you just said it, you would not do it again? In other words, if somebody came to you and said, look, I've really got this. I can demonstrate it for you. I can show you there's more out than in. It's free energy, whatever you want to call it. I need $100,000 to develop it. What would you say?
I would say no. I would say and I could write that check tomorrow, no problem. I would say if you have something, go and create it and bring it to me, and we will replicate it. But in terms of doing it this other way, we tried that. We actually, I think over the years maybe put $800,000 or $900,000 into those sort of efforts with various folks. Wow. Not a lot of money. I mean, as R&D programs go. I mean, hell, my ER had a $20 million budget for, an ER in one town. But I tell people that, this approach is inherently risky. And we did it because that's all the resources we had. Now I've concluded what we really need to do is create a research and development lab where these brilliant geniuses can be brought together and they can be supported and protected and work. And you know what? We'll do something we couldn't have done a few years ago. We'll stream it live on Ustream and dare someone to come in here and threaten these folks. And I think the other mistake that many of these inventors have made is that they tried to go the intellectual property route with venture capital or through the patent system. Because if you go that route, basically they're going to get it or you're a dead man walking. So I think the only way to do it is that you create it and then you dump it into the internet. You have multiple academic centers, which we've already identified, by the way, reproduce it independently, and you get it out there and you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube quickly and forcefully. I think any other approach, if you look at the history of this, Dr. Tom Bearden, who's also lieutenant colonel in the Army, I was at his home discussing this, and he lives there in Huntsville near the Marshall Space Flight Center, and he and I discussed this for days, and he said basically the mistakes that have been made, there's a set number of them that you can sort of look over the last few decades and see that one inventor after another has made. The big mistake is that people think that they're going to beat someone in the secrecy game. They're not. These guys know everything, everyone. I don't care if you're in the jungle of the Amazon. They're going to know what you're doing and what you got. So you need to be able to have a system, which we have, where you can get it out to the public very quickly. But if you try to sit on it in a secret way and try to make it a intellectual property battle or a patent issue, you're never going to succeed. You're going to lose because you're going to enter into a system that is gamed against you. So I tell people that if they want to do this, they need to learn from history or we're going to be doomed to repeat it. And
from my own part, if somebody set a bullet on the table and said, this bullet has your name on it, I'm being honest here, that would do it. I mean, that would do it. I've got a family. So folks, think of it yourself. If you had this information in your hand, and it was going to help the world, it was going to help the country, it's going to help everybody. But they're saying they're going to kill you and they're going to kill your family. What would you do? I think the answer is pretty clear. You'd probably end up buckling.
Well, and that's why you can't do it that way. This is why you have to have a large number of people. You need to have it all being done and watched publicly in real time. And that's what I've concluded over the last decade of looking into this. And I think that that's a very unconventional way. Now, of course, when you go to Silicon Valley and tell a venture capital that, their eyes roll back because they're all about the secrecy of the next iPhone, whatever.
Sure.
So, and I tell them, look, you can do that with something that's trivial and unimportant, like the products coming out of Cupertino for Apple. I mean, those things don't do anything. I mean, yes, you can talk on them, and they're cool, and they look nice, but they're made in a slave factory in China. So who cares? They're not.
You hardly ever hear of leaks. I mean, never.
Yeah, of course.
An apple gets left in a bar somewhere, but beyond that, there's a bullet. There's a bullet on the table with your name.
Is that, for all our vaulted technology, and this is one of the things I was talking with a lot of these folks about at this meeting out in this island in the Pacific, is that yes, we have some cool communication devices and smartphones and computers, but guess what? We're plugging them into a coal-fired power grid that is this creaky thing that is from the late 1800s and early 1900s in terms of its concept. So I said, we're on the one hand, we have one foot sort of in the future with the internet and all these electronics, but most of our balance is tilted into this early industrial age fossil fuel world that really should have run its course many, many decades ago. And
but
so
it hasn't.
It hasn't. And the problem is that you have so many powerful vested interests that don't want to see that change happen. And it becomes a really easy thing to understand once you understand that it's a massive amount of geopolitical power behind the current system. I mean, even the whole Middle East situation, Art. I mean, we use the buzzword in Washington of our vital national security interests. That's what you hear over. It's a mantra. But what that really means is oil. OIL. I mean, what's over there? I mean, date palms and goats and what.
I know. I agree with you. It's oil.
I mean, and there's Israel, but Israel has 300 nuclear weapons. Believe me, they can take care of themselves.
Right. All right, so it's oil. I do agree with that, and I do agree that there would be so much interest in keeping oil and the money from oil to ourselves. Not that we do. We should a lot of it to our enemies. But there's so much serious interest in oil revenue continuing as it has been that I'm sure that people's lives wouldn't be much. I mean, if they got in the way, then there's a bullet with your name on it.
Well, and this is the whole thing that they discovered with, Gore Vidal wrote the foreword to this book years ago called Into the Buzzsaw, where they studied various journalists who started to drill down on some really sensitive things. And they would either be fired or they would disappear or they died mysteriously. It's a fantastic book. It's actually a mainstream book. And what you find when you look into this is that this is an issue that's much bigger than INSCOM or any of the things that led to those sort of events happening that Gore Vidal was talking about. And I think that now we're talking about it isn't just money and oil. It's the macroeconomic system, and that would change. Imagine if every village or home or business had its own so-called zero point or quantum vacuum generator that would pull energy out of it. Okay, and suddenly you have all of India and China and the developing world, what used to be called the third world, being able to be lifted up out of poverty. But what would happen is that there would be a relative diminution, a reduction in the centralized power of the current world system. And so this is really what it's about. I remember years ago, the admiral in charge of CONUS, Continental United States Security, told our military team and the people who worked with me for years trying to walk me through this system that his job was really maintaining the status quo of the world energy supply.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for just a second and say, all right, Doctor, let's imagine for a second that that this switch did occur. What if I were to suggest to you that the economic disruption from suddenly cutting the oil spigot, no longer needing oil, would be so great that the economic collapse we just went through would be child's play? I'm just playing devil's advocate, but I'm sure there are people who believe that, right?
Oh, there are, and I think that there's some merit to that, and I'm not going to disagree with the fact that had these technologies been transitioned in 80 years ago, we wouldn't be in the jackpot we're in now. But what are we going to wait for all those polar ice caps to melt and for us to go to World War III in the South China Sea over oil? I mean, at a certain point, we're going to have to decide to transition out of the 1800s to early 1900s industrial era into the future. Now,
well, maybe, but I'm telling you right now. Before you go on, Doctor, you're talking about, for example, the Spratly Islands, which are near the Philippines. Let me tell you something.
Right.
The United States right now is putting naval and air forces, or about to, back in the Philippines.
I know that.
So what do you think they imagine is going to happen? I think they imagine that if necessary, we're going to protect the Spratlys, by God.
Right, and I think this gets into the question also of what they're discovering in the oil reserves that are there, in the South China Sea and other areas that are falling already into dispute. This is a problem that's going to just go on and on and on unless we deal with it. The other point I make is it isn't as if someone's going to come out with one of these technologies and they're going to wave a magic wand, and your car and my car are going to have an engine different from what's in it. It's about a 15-year turnover time on heavy, and not an iPhone or a smartphone. But when you're talking about someone's engine or someone's electric power grid, you're not going to do that. You're not going to turn that massive ship on a dime. You're turning a massive super tanker that takes 5 miles to turn around. So I think that when you look at that, there's about a 15 to 20-year period of transition that we have if technology were to come out today. And I think that if it's done in an intelligent way, I think if it's done in a way that allows for a soft landing out of the fossil fuel economy into this new high-tech sector, and this was my argument that I made all these leaders.
Yeah, but I don't know how you do that. Hold on, Doctor. We're going to take a break here, and then we'll talk about a soft landing.
Right.
I can't imagine a soft landing. He's talking about an economic soft landing. In other words, if something came out that essentially was free entry, 0 point, whatever you want to call it. And it was an out, and you could have a little black box. This is just sort of my imagination, a little black box in the back of your home, and it would take care of all your energy needs. There's no way that I see a soft landing there, and if there is, when we get back, we'll let the doctor describe it to us, but I just can't. That's a hard landing. Oh, listen to this bumper music. I've heard this. I know I've heard this. Anyway, we'll be back in a moment.
All right, definitely muting because I know that one does get a copyright strike. Again, we'll return to Dark Matter with Steven Greer and Art Bell the moment the music bumper is finished.
Whereof was that the military industrial, complex, that's it. Military industrial complex. So, if we have free energy, then we don't need oil, and we can't have any wars anymore. Listen about something else, and it was about oil, so I don't know, I'm confused. I don't see, Doctor, how we're going to come out of this, and you're welcome to explain, with a soft landing, but go right ahead.
Well, it's relative. I'm comparing this transition or soft landing to sort of an existential terminus where we run up, where it's Mad Max under the Thunderdome. We're fighting over the last barrel of oil, and we have both polar ice caps have disappeared, and vast areas of the land masses are underwater, et cetera, and so on. So, which is going to be harder? I mean, if we came together as people and said, look, this is something we need to disclose the fact we're not alone in the universe. We need to figure out how to make peaceful contact with these civilizations. We haven't talked about that. And we have to figure out how to bring these technologies that have been bottled up for so long, that are at the root of the secrecy behind UFOs, out in a way that is as least disruptive as possible. Now, my view on this, and this is something which, of course, people would disagree with me on, is that we have to do it because it's the only possible out. I mean, my farm here in Virginia runs on solar, but it's not a practical solution for the average person because it's enormously expensive. It's the largest private solar farm in Virginia.
I do the same thing here. Yeah. Very expensive.
Yeah, and so, but I'm trying to walk the walk to the extent I can. But I think that if you're looking at the planet and you're looking strategically down the road, not the next quarterly return report at Goldman Sachs, but I'm looking, 5, 10, 20, 30 years down, that if we began to bring this information and technology out in a way that focused on the energy generation component and not the propulsive part, but by propulsion, I'm talking about the anti-grav stuff. Because, all right, so now this gets into this whole controversy. I had a meeting a couple years ago in Washington, and the head of what was euphemistically called the Future Technologies of the Air Force, this colonel, which means technologies they already have. And he got into this discussion with me about the weaponization of these delivery systems where you're going very, very fast using this kind of gravity control technology that we have in classified projects. By the way, a lot of the so-called UFOs that people see zipping around near Edwards and Nellis Air Force Base, so-called Area 51, are actually, and up there in Provo at the Dugway Proving Grounds, those are actually man-made EMGs, electromagnetic gravitic.
By the way, Doctor, were you shocked beyond belief when the government recently said Area 51 is real?
Well, no, because they said, no, it's real, but at the same time, they said, of course, nothing in that critical is going on there, and it's just conventional stuff. But, by the way, the area that you're concerned about at that facility is Pahoot Mesa and Groom Lake, and S4, S9, S12, and the really state-of-the-art facilities, like I said, are up in Utah outside of Provo at the Dugway Proving Grounds. And
I heard that, but who knows what to believe? I mean, both areas are... Well, I
have folks who've been in.
You can't go visit.
Well, no, you can. In fact, there are no roads into this particular area at Dugway, and the airspace over it restricted and classified. So there you have it.
Have you seen the signs that say lethal force authorized? You don't go past that.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I've been out there, and you don't, and so obviously you get the same thing in the outback of at Pine Gap in Australia. In fact, I'm looking at a fantastic photograph of Pine Gap right now that a guy who worked there just sent to me last week. What you find is that there are all these sort of facilities that don't get talked about a lot, and then of course, 40 years after the heyday of Area 51, which was back in the 60s, by the way, the government says, "Oh well, it does exist." Well, yeah, okay. So by the time they acknowledge it, it's probably everything's been moved of any criticality.
Maybe. I don't know.
It's all underground anyway.
There's so many mind games going on that who knows.
It's all underground. Everything important is underground. Nothing's above the surface. If it's important, it's subterranean.
Have you ever, Doctor, had anybody tell you where the beings from the crash at Roswell, are they or were they at 51, or were they sent out to Ohio, or, where?
Well, the ones, first of all, there was apparently one that lived. And the most, that particular being was moved, from my understanding, to various bases over the years. And I have a witness who actually saw it at Camp Perry in Virginia, believe it or not. So, who actually on a deathbed confessional and in the video, which we have, talked about this. But of course, the others being deceased, and I know that subsequently there were a number of kind of Tesla coil type EMP electromagnetic pulse weapons that were developed between 1945 and the 60s that were able to target these vehicles when they would be in this dimension. And we can talk about this if you wish, and would be able to hit them. And so at Fort Huachuca, if you go to Arizona and you go to Tombstone, there's a place called Fort Huachuca, which is actually Army Intelligence Headquarters, and there is an underground facility there. A man that's on my team had worked in there, and he reported that there were 9 separate ET craft in various bodies that have been autopsied that were in storage there. So I think it's been dispersed, and over the years it's been in a number of locations.
Okay, move back for a second to a soft landing. I mean, as I mentioned, if there was a little black box at the corner of your house and you had an energy source that would keep you going, keep your house warm and toasty in the winter and cool in summer and all the rest of it, it would take care of your energy needs. I just don't see how you get a soft landing.
Well, I think it's going to be, as I said, I'm using it relatively soft. I mean, compared to the alternative, which is cataclysmic. But no, yes. I think at this point it's going to be a difficult transition because it's been delayed. The analogy I use is that, you got a leak in your roof and you put it off month after month and year after year, and eventually the whole structure of the house starts to rot and fall in. So, yes, we should have dealt with this issue a long time ago. And I remember sitting, there was an old, you probably remember who this guy was. I'm not know if a lot of your listeners will, but Senator Barry Goldwater, who ran for president in the 60s, and he was also an Air Force general, and he knew about this just because he knew some pilots that had encounters with these UFOs at fairly close range. And he was also friends with General Curtis LeMay, who of course, it was back in those days, it was bombing back to the Stone Age LeMay because he was advocating using nuclear bombs and into China back then. But at any rate, I'm sitting in Barry Goldwater's living room. This is a hilarious story in a way. And Barry Goldwater, and I had an assistant with me, and he had left the Senate, and of course John McCain took his seat. And I'm sitting in Barry Goldwater's living room, and his wife is there in Paradise Valley, there in the Phoenix area. And we start talking about this, and he was, this guy wasn't at all religious, I'll tell you that. He was conservative, but in the libertarian sort of way. And every other word was a cuss word. And I'm sitting in his living room, and he said, Dr. Greer, is a goddamn mistake then and a goddamn mistake now that any of this was kept secret. And I said, yes, you're right. And we started talking about this. I said, well, what inquiries have you made, Senator? And he said, well, he asked General LeMay to get him into the so-called Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base there. years ago because he was friends with Curtis LeMay, and he was an Air Force general, and Goldwater was an Air Force general in the Air Force Reserves. And Curtis LeMay turned to him and said, "God damn it, Barry, I can't even get into that area anymore. And if you ever ask me about this again, I will see that you are court-martialed out of the Air Force."
I've heard that.
Now I'm sitting, and this is from Barry Goldwater's lips to my ears, and I have a witness to this. And I asked Senator Goldwater, I said, was Curtis LeMay serious? He said he was serious as a heart attack, and he never inquired about this again.
You know, there may be a recording of that. There actually may be a recording of that or something very similar. I actually heard it. But again, I've got to drag you right back to this soft landing. If you had zero energy in your hand, Doctor, I mean in your hand,
right?
And you had yet been presented with a bullet with your name on it,
well,
how would you introduce it into society in some way that wouldn't crash the economy?
I think that you have to define crash the economy. I think that will there be a big hit on the futures markets for oil and commodities? Yes. But
a monstrous hit.
There'll be a big hit. But at the same time, we're taking a big hit now. I mean, let's get out of our, Eurocentric and American view for 1 minute and look at the fact that 48% of the population of the world doesn't even have indoor plumbing, doesn't have a pot to pee in, the proverbial pot to pee in.
Right.
So if you look, I mean, in a sense, we're living through an economic catastrophe now. We've just been insulated from it because we've been gobbling up all the fossil fuels and resources for decades. But in the rest of the world, you have unspeakable poverty in India and China and South America and all over the world. I travel all over the world, and you've seen it.
I do too.
And so, I think if we look at this and get out of our own sort of narcissistic, ethnocentric viewpoint, we see that we're actually...
Wait a minute. That's a synonym for exceptionalism, isn't it?
Well, no, I think we can be exceptional in a way that doesn't have to be stupid and narcissistic. And I think this gets into, what does real leadership consist of? By the way, this meeting I was at in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was a leadership conference for all these folks. And I said, here's the leadership that we need. People with the courage to disclose this information, lead the way to bring this out, and figure out how to transition into a new economy. And I said, will it be easy? No. But, rebuilding after World War II wasn't easy. And so I think that it's a question of not only does it have to happen, because the alternative is cataclysmic in my view, but it needs to happen the sooner the better, because the longer we put off this transition, the more difficult the landing's going to be. It's going to be harder and harder and harder, not easier. So I think that gets into the problem is that, instead of, you look in the 1920s, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. Now there's 7. So, and if these technologies had been allowed to begin to come out from the minds of inventors and not been gobbled up by J.P. Morgan and other people, which did happen, we would have had this transition 80 years ago. But we didn't. But now, of course, in every generation of people in power think that, let's kick this can down the road. And this you see a lot with a lot of problems in Washington. Let's kick it down the road and kick it down the road. But now,
if we couldn't do it then, would you just told us? And you're allowing that it would be much, much harder to do it now, and that it's infinitely harder now.
Yep.
How are we ever going to get it out?
Well, but we have something now that didn't exist 10 years ago, and that is the fact that a huge percentage of the world's population, even people who don't have indoor plumbing, have the internet. And I think that if you get the information and you get the technology out, once you have an operating system that works, it's going to be very hard to stop it. And
maybe what you have to do, Doctor, is get the information, get the schematics, and suddenly just sort of fire it to every news outlet in the whole world and then run like hell.
Yes. Well, if my group could develop something that could get independently tested this way, And where I knew that it wasn't a false alert, we would do exactly that. But more importantly, get it into the hands of a whole lot of different engineers all over the world who reproduce it. And this is why you have to bypass this sort of secrecy, patent avenue, intellectual property route, because that's going to be your Achilles heel. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So let's get it on the record. Do you have that information now?
Well, it's hard for me to say if I have that information. Here's what I will tell you. I have I have a disk with a lot of confiscated patents and information on it that was given to me by someone who was being courted by the CIA. And are any of those systems that would actually work as advertised? I don't know. Because A, I'm not an engineer, and B, I don't have a laboratory to put these things to the test. And that's the whole problem. It's a chicken-egg issue. The people who I know who have had some of these systems end up getting intimidated. And now here's a true story that people say it's apocryphal, but it's absolutely true. There's a man that is a physicist who was at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and he had and I know the CIA doesn't like me to say this, but he had a barium titanate crystal and he had a voltage wire wrapped around it and voltage going into it, and at a certain frequency, resonant frequency, and an output signal that was 10 times more wattage, real power, than the input. Well, in come some goons, and he was not patenting this. He was doing an experiment at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, which is in the Bay Area. And in come these guys. They confiscate his system. They actually take him and put him in a mental hospital and put him on a Thorazine drip and do all kinds of stuff. Now, this man is one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. But, is he going to try to pull this stunt by himself again? No. This is why we're telling people we're trying to put the people together to create an energy research lab where we can do this as safely as we can, but that's being observed on the internet in real time. And I think that's a very different approach to how most people would develop a technology like this. And I actually
the Thorazine says,
yeah, well, the Thorazine just says, he's in a stupor. It's a terrible drug. But I think that this is how, suppression has happened in a million different ways. And as I look at it, if we're going to make a difference into the future, we're going to have to figure out how to not make these same mistakes over and over again.
Can we?
Yes, I think we can, but we're going to have to pull our resources and involve the public in a very large way. I don't think it can be done, as I said earlier, in a small way at isolated people working on this as lone wolves. This is why what our plan is to put together a research and development laboratory where all this is being done very open and open source, frankly, and put that together with some of the most brilliant engineers and physicists that we've identified over the last 15 years, and make a run at this. And would it be a risky thing to do? Yeah, it'd be a risky thing to do, but I think it's riskier to sit on our hands and do nothing.
All right, you said you had a DVD or a CD or a computer full of many of these type things. Do you think you've got the goods in there? Is it your guess that was yes?
Yes. I think that if we could put together a research team, probably within 12 to 24 months, we'd have an operating system out that would do as what we're discussing. The reason for that is that we've studied so many different breakthroughs that have happened over the years. For example, we've identified the people who worked directly with this guy named Stan Meyer, who had a car that was running on water because he had an electronic system that was actually pulling energy out of the zero-point field so that he could dissociate hydrogen and oxygen out of water and run a car on it.
Are you aware there's a fellow in the Philippines, no joke, who is driving a car around Manila that runs on water?
Well, I've heard of these, and a few of them we've looked into, and they end up not being as advertised. But if that's true, that's great. What I say to people is that it doesn't help if you have one guy running around the Philippines on this. You've got to move it into the mass public. And I think but now, did Stan Meyer actually have that? Yes, but if you look at his patents, he altered the frequencies of the hertz, the cycles per second, and the resonant frequencies, so that no one could do it. Well, of course, the whole point of a patent is to create something that would be protected, and you can put all the information in there. But he didn't. And so when he died, mysteriously and very suddenly, back in 1996, I believe, what he left was a lot of material which we were trying to get, and ended up a big corporation came in and bought it out from under us, from his estate. Now, one of the things he had in there was a toroid. It looks like a donut, and it had a magnetically charged fluid in it, and that was definitely so-called free energy, and it had a national security order on it. But 3 of the people who worked with Stan Meyer are still living. We've identified them, and they would love to work in a research lab like this. So what I said to people is that a lot of our work has been to collect the information, but more importantly, the people who understand the principles and the physics. Now, how do you put them together in a way that they can, as safely as possible, work on something like this and live to see tomorrow? And that's what we're trying to do now at this phase of our project.
Living to see tomorrow. That's good. All right, hold it right there. Here's where we're going to take a break for a moment and a deep breath. Free energy. How would you do it, folks, so that it was a soft landing?
Alrighty, so they're going to break. We will stay in mute until the musical bumper is done. Meanwhile, let's do a little bit down in the fun dungeon.
Welcome back, and here we go. I'm still not clear on a soft landing. I just don't know how you do this kind of thing. Piecemeal, I just don't get it.
Well, I don't know. It wouldn't be piecemeal, but maybe soft landing is not the correct term, but I think it's a relative term, as I said, compared to what we're facing if we don't deal with this issue. And
by when?
And I think I think it should have been done decades ago. So as soon as possible is all I can say.
Well, yeah, but if you look at the current oil-based economy, and you look at oil disappearing and getting more expensive, there's going to be a dollar figure. I mean, eventually you're going to be able to pin it to a dollar figure. By the time it's $15 a gallon, $20 a gallon, somewhere in there is a breaking point.
Well, and what would actually happen with this information even coming out on a proof of principle system where it was widely known around the world, is that oil would begin to trend down very steeply, because all those markets are anticipatory. All the futures markets and commodity trading market, they would begin to factor that into the value of oil. Right now, the value of oil has a couple premiums on it. You have the war premium, the chaos in the Middle East, and China industrializing at 8, 10, 12% a year. It's slowing down right now a little bit. It's eased up, but over the long haul, that's the kind of problem we're facing. And I think all this does is build in the likelihood of growing disparities between the wealthy and the unfortunate, and that's a prescription, if you look at history, for revolution and turmoil. So I think the sooner that we can come together as a people to transition out of those systems into something practical, and by practical, I'm not knocking solar and wind, it's just not a very practical, energy-dense solution for a planet with 7 billion people.
No, it's getting better. Here in Nevada and in California, we've got these new solar collectors. I don't know if you've seen them.
Oh, yes.
Very large towers with hundreds and thousands of reflectors pointed at the tower, and they're getting to be fairly efficient.
Yes, but you're talking about that one facility there near the California-Nevada border, costing in the $2 billion range. Well, my God, I mean, the money they put into that, you could have developed these other technologies and begin to have them coming out like sausages off the conveyor belt.
Well, you can throw billions of dollars around, but check out the price of the last war we were in.
Yeah, that was a couple $1 trillion if you factor all the aspects of it in, and
that's a lot of mirrors.
Yeah, it is, and I think that there are solutions, but ultimately they're going to be too little, too late. That's my concern, and I think it's a temporizing maybe technology to utilize those. I think the real solutions are these ones that have been resisted because they are, in my view, they're transformative. In the view of the conventional wisdom, they're disruptive. And I think that depending on where you're sitting on which side of the fence, it is disruptive. And, you know, it's interesting. A few years ago, back when W was the president of the United States, I was meeting with his sort of consigliere on energy and nuclear power, and it was this Harvard law guy, and we're sitting at the University Club there up the street from the White House, and you know, this is a place you see Rumsfeld and all these folks in there, and he's telling me that anybody who becomes president or someone in a very powerful corporate position, no matter whether they're left or right or center or liberal or conservative and all these labels, they don't mean anything. He says basically they get into those positions and they govern and make policies that are very conservative in the traditional sense of not having big change happen. And the reason for that is that they don't want to supervise something this big. You know, I mean, this is such a big change. If you add up all the changes that have happened since the 1850s to now, the disclosure of this information would dwarf all of them added together in terms of the way it would change the way we're living on this planet. Now, to me, that's needed, and it's a good thing. It's been forestalled for too long. But if you're in a position where you're just trying to maintain the status quo, you know, you look at the edge, you go to the edge of this precipice, and you're going to go, good God, I'm not taking this leap. So
if they don't act pretty soon, they're going to be supervising billions of people starving to death. They're going to be supervising wars that are going to be so out of control that it'll be the end anyway. So,
well, see, this is what I was saying to you earlier, is that from my perspective, any way you slice it, the wise thing to do is to come together and figure out how to bring out these really advanced technologies and physics in a way that is as non-disruptive as possible, knowing
I don't know what that is. How about a toy?
Yeah, a toy. No, I mean, there's something actually going to run something.
Well,
and, you know,
I know, but we're talking about baby steps here. If you come out with a toy that seems to demonstrate over unity, believe me, people pay attention to that.
Well, actually, there have been. There's right now a tritium battery that's exhibiting this. There are a few small, you know, at the level of lighting an LED that are out there right now. But I think that, you know, it kind of gets lost in the dialogue. And I think to make a change on this, you're going to need to bring out something that the average person is going to see a practical application for it. And I think that is why, I mean, getting back to the secrecy and the ridicule of the UFO subject, the secrecy and the ridicule is rooted in the fact that the implications of this are so huge. It's not because it's silly. I mean, it's been portrayed silly. You know, I have this really, it's sort of a funny CIA document from 1953 and it talks about the CIA engaging Disney Studios to make cartoons about ETs and UFOs so that the subject would be the matter of ridicule and mirth and sort of levity instead of being something serious. And yet you have the first CIA director in this letter that I was quoting from earlier in the show, talking about how people are soberly concerned about this and understand that this is an enormously important issue. And I think that it's because it has so many implications that it has been ridiculed and has been sort of pigeonholed into the silly season of all things ufological, which, you know,
okay. For a second, let's come back to a serious matter, and that is this question. Are we currently in any sort of productive dialogue with them?
Well, you know, I can't, or when you say we who?
We humans.
I suspect, yes. I although not on an official level. What I learned in studying this and leading teams that attempt to make contact is that I think individual humans have had contact experiences. Whether the government at some point had some liaison that then fell apart, that's possible. Although I don't see a great deal of evidence for it. The closest I get is from after meeting with these guys, these French officials, they sent me a letter from a man who was with Eisenhower when apparently he met with some ETs there at Muroc, which is near where Edwards Air Force Base is now, back, I believe, in April of 1956, if my memory serves me correctly. And so apparently there were some attempts to make this sort of more open contact, but it became very dysfunctional because, the motivations for the dialogue were not what they should have been.
All right. Well, we'll probably never really hear about that. What do you know, Doctor, about ET contact that has occurred at the macro level that you consider to be legitimate?
Well, I think it's happened with many individuals who've had contact experiences with these civilizations and the individuals. And what I've done, there's something we started back about 20 years ago called the CE5 Initiative, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, is to train people in the concept of contact and the concept of so-called remote viewing and the use of consciousness and other technologies to interface with these civilizations. And when we've done that, we've had some really strange but amazing experiences that have happened. And that's been in every spectrum, photographic, video, electronic, and even, objects and the beings that are very, very close to us. If you look at on our website under CE5 on the top header at SeriousDisclosure.com, you can go through that, and there's some photographs that are pretty unusual of what appear to be ET and transdimensional beings that are very near us in places all over the world. So, so what does that constitute contact? I think it does, and I think the question becomes, why are under the CE5 photos and videos at the bottom of that section, you see all these unusual things, like not far from where you live in Joshua Tree, we were having this strange series of experience where we had these electronics set up, and all of a sudden we could start getting these signals through all these electronics. And then we see this, what looks like a sphere, appear in the desert there in the middle of Joshua Tree National Park, and there are about 30, 40 of us there. And this thing floats over and then disappears, and then you start hearing in thin air, there's nothing there, what sound like some people talking. Now, it was in English. And so a member of our team took a camera, and you can see these photographs, and there's this being kind of floating almost in a holographic light area right outside where our chairs were. This is an actual photograph, waving at us. And this being has a huge head, has concave areas on the skull, is there. And many people who were there were having other kinds of unusual experiences in consciousness electronically and what have you. And I think one of the things that people, when they begin to have this sort of experience, have to understand is if you're dealing with an actual ET, it's going to be strange. Why? Because if they're moving beyond the speed of light from one star system to another, they're dropping out of linear space-time and traversing other dimensions into this point in space and time. So they are all, by definition, a priori, they are all transdimensional or interdimensional and ET. I remember Jacques Vallée and I had this discussion once where he said, well, are they ET or are they interdimensional? I said, well, they're both. I mean, if it was just something like the spirit world or a ghost, they don't need a spacecraft that materializes and lands at Rendlesham Forest Air Force Base.
No, they had that ability or they couldn't even get here.
Yeah, so this gets into this whole discussion of a whole new understanding of physics and space and time, where you have enfolded within any, say, volume of 3D, other dimensions that you can traverse through to get from one star system to another. And this is what they're doing. And so when they do appear, it can be very unusual. They can appear and then disappear, or they can be partially in this dimension, or it almost looks like a hologram or some translucent a circular or disc or triangular shaped object. And in fact, one of the top secret witness guys we just put up from the Air Force was at Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma back years ago when one of these objects appeared over the hot nuclear area of this Air Force Base. And you could see it. It was like a cobalt blue, but it was translucent. It wasn't fully in this dimension, but it was moving over this area where our planes were loaded with hot nuclear weapons to take off in an emergency. And all the alarms went off. So it was enough in this dimension, and yet it could go straight through. It was not solid, so it could pass straight through these aircraft. And of course, in World War II, everybody knows the group the Foo Fighters. Well, guess where they got their name? Foo Fighters. Dave Grohl got that from. We brought up this information about in World War II there were these objects that were called Foo Fighters that were like that were flying around our aircraft. Hitler thought it was a secret Allied weapon. Mm-hmm. We thought it was a secret Nazi weapon. Now, a member of my team, Dr. Altschuler in Denver, very renowned hematologist, pathologist, wonderful man, passed away of cancer a few years ago. He was General Jimmy Doolittle's nephew. And Jimmy Doolittle, the general, a famous general of World War II, told him, look, I was sent over there by Roosevelt to look into what these Foo Fighters were. And so he goes over there and comes back to the White House and tells President Roosevelt, FDR, that they are, and I'm quoting, they are interplanetary vehicles, but they were behaving in this unusual way. Now, that is a 100% true story. So this is now goes all the way back before Truman to FDR. And these Foo Fighters that were reported in the European theater of operations, I'm sure they must have been seen in Asia as well, were very unusual because sometimes they'd be fully materialized, but often they would be in this form where they're partially in this 3D and partially not, and they would literally come straight through some of our aircraft. And so, of course, I mean, this is the 1940s, and people are completely perplexed. I mean, most people would be perplexed by this today in 2013, but certainly in the 40s they were perplexed. And yet, that's how far back we know that there were these sort of really well-known and high-level military encounters that were getting reported back to the chain of command.
All right, well, let me ask you what everybody asks about this, and that is that, okay, a long, long history of attempts at contact and so forth and so on. So the gigantic question that everybody asks is, if they want contact, then why not the White House lawn or the equivalent thereof and anywhere else in the world? Why not?
Well, you know, it was funny. Larry King asked me, and I said, look, first of all, who's White House? You know, the one in Bogota, Colombia, or the one in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, whatever.
Right. Number one. Number two, they'd be blown out of the sky. Number three, I think
hold on. How do we blow them out of the sky? They cross dimensions to get here. Surely, one of our Hellfires or whatever we're going to use probably isn't going to work.
Well, no, but these electromagnetic weapons do when they're in this dimension, and this is another whole discussion of what kind of covert technologies exist. Everyone assumes that our technologies have stood still, and the most advanced thing we have is a cruise missile. I mean, from the 70s or 80s. I mean, this is nonsense. And I think that the bigger question is, no one can know this for certain, but my reading of this, having gone out for thousands of hours under the skies with people, looking at the stars, looking at objects that come in, is that I think they're waiting for us. I think the ball is in our court. Everyone thinks that somehow they're going to behave the way we might, and that is just come in there and land on the White House lawn. I think that in reality, it's sort of a cosmic Rorschach test how you view this. And the way I view this is that they're actually waiting for us to awaken to their reality in a way that is peaceful and doesn't create any more chaos than we already have on this planet, number one. And number two, that we approach them in a way that is not militarized and weaponized. And I think, so our approach to it has been all wrong. Now, the larger, I think another question is, a lot of what people are asking for has already happened. There was an event in Montreal, I believe it was 1990, where one of these objects was over downtown Montreal for a very long time and was seen by many people. The events in Belgium in between 1989 and 92, 91, 92, there were tens of thousands of people that would see these objects hovering over cities and over towns and what have you. And it did make it a little bit into the media. And so this gets into another question. Why should they force the issue if we want to be so dysfunctional that we keep lying to each other about this? What is going on? And I think to the extent that we facilitate disclosure, to that extent it is saying to them, to the visitors, that we're ready to acknowledge their presence. So I think that it's actually, it's more like a cosmic mirror. The way that you respond to this whole issue says more about ourselves or yourself than it does about these civilizations. And I think they're wise enough and patient enough to see if we can begin to get this right.
All right, Doctor, I know you had a number of programs trying to initiate contact, and you did that years ago.
No, we're still doing it.
How productive was it? What did you do?
Well, we still are doing it, and they've been very productive. That's why if people go to the website and go to the CE5 section, they'll see that. And there's a book that we have released not too long ago called Contact, Countdown to Transformation, that goes through all the dozens of events that have happened. And they're like this one in Joshua Tree. Some have amazing photographic and electronic evidence. Others have been very transitory. But what I concluded from it is that they're willing to make contact with groups of people if people approach them in a way that is peaceful and you're not running around like chickens with your head cut off.
Okay, but after you've got contact, you get productive dialogue. I mean, we're talking about energy here and all kinds of things that they could potentially tell us, which are very, very valuable to the human race. So if you get contact, how do you progress from that to dialogue?
Well, I don't think you're sitting there having a cup of coffee speaking English. I think it happens on a level that's some would call it very metaphysical or paranormal. I don't call it that. In consciousness with remote viewing and at that level. Whether it progresses to another level, we'll see. I think on that level, it's happened to many, many, many people who've been on our teams. My own experience with this dates back when I was a teenager, is that it was very highly in that area of the science of consciousness and the understanding of how the mind and consciousness is the ultimate field of energy and non-locality. And they seem to understand that. And so I think that most of the contact that has happened up to this point isn't a sort of a verbal discussion or a sort of translatable language so much as it is on that level.
So you're saying that our consciousness has got to be raised, and at some point there'll be a dialogue when we get to their level.
Well, not to their level necessarily, but certainly we have had that dialogue, but it's been on the level of consciousness and remote viewing. And for those of you people who don't know that term, it's the ability to access consciousness in its non-local form and see remote places or remote points in space or time. Now, one of the things that our film deals with, the film Sirius, S-I-R-I-U-S, is that it deals with this question of, is our own individual consciousness, is it actually what we think it is? In other words, we associate it with just our egos and our individualities, but is there an aspect of our consciousness that's operating in sort of a field that isn't bound or limited by space and time? And the answer to that is yes, and the science on it is actually quite clear. You know, Einstein talked about the spooky effect and the spooky phenomenon, where you do something with a proton in one point in space and it's mirrored in another point. They've now discovered mirror neurons. Recently, they found that actually in experiments with rats, that there's precognition and reactions that happen. And on the cellular level, so there's all this sort of phenomenon that has to do with consciousness and the mind. Which
I think it does as well. I'm convinced that it does.
And the ET contact experiences seem to be where that intersects with these visitors from other star systems. They understand that because, let's face it, you're not going to communicate across multiple light years of space using an electromagnetic signal from AT&T that's traveling at the speed of light. It would take thousands of years to get the signal there and back. So you're dealing.
And if you did, you'd probably get a dropped call.
You'd get a dropped call. So in this case, you're dealing with something that a concept I came up with, which may be too controversial to go into here, back in the 90s, called consciousness-assisted technologies and technology-assisted consciousness. And what I discovered through some experiences I had is that these civilizations have the equivalent of a communication device that interfaces directly with coherent, clear thought from individuals. And that the ETs actually, when they are navigating their craft or communicating, are hooking their own consciousness and thought through these systems that go at what have been called scalar signals that are multiples of the speed of light, but that interface up with thought and consciousness. So it works both ways. There's consciousness assisting the technology, where the individual is interfacing with the technology of the spacecraft or the communication device, but they also have technologies that augment or project their own thought and consciousness. And it works both directions. And in 1991, when I wrote this in a paper, I had a senior aerospace scientist call me from McDonnell Douglas, which is now part of Boeing. He said, "How do you know this?" He says, because they had discovered the same thing in some research they were doing at McDonnell Douglas, because old man McDonnell was really into all this. Mm-hmm. And I said, from an experience I had when I was a teenager with these visitors, that was quite clear to me that they had that ability. And he said, "Well, you're correct." And he said, "But and ultimately this begins to be the bigger question of a paradigm that we're going to go through. This huge shift is not just an energy generation and are we alone in the universe, but ultimately it's opening a doorway, I think, into who are we, and what does it really mean to have the potential of a human being." And I think that potential is amazing because it includes not only the ability to travel interstellar, but to experience states of consciousness that take you through other dimensions, and understanding that in a very clear way, where it becomes scientific and where the scientific evidence builds. And, the physicist Goswami wrote The Self-Aware Universe, and I don't know if you've read that book, but and Edgar Mitchell, who's an astronaut that I've worked with, who founded the Noetic Sciences Institute, and they've done a lot of study on how mind and consciousness and thought are actually not limited by, your brainwave activity or just your body. And that there is this element. I think that that's why when you talk about contact with these civilizations, you're going to have to then add in this other area of exploration of the science of consciousness and understanding of a new type of physics that is awareness.
Well, you may be onto something there. You mentioned Edgar Mitchell. I've had him on the show, of course, and maybe you've got some comment on this, but I thought it one of the oddest things, and since you brought up his name, I'll mention it. He walked on the moon, and I got to interview him.
Yes.
And it was an odd interview in the sense that when I asked him to relate his feelings, his mindset, what he thought of, what he saw, what he felt, any senses that he could give to me at all about his experience walking on the moon, he couldn't. He actually couldn't. And I found that disturbing, and I've never gotten over it, Dr. Greer. Have you ever spoken to him about that?
Yeah, I have, but it was in his backyard, and he explained it as something that was really transformative in consciousness, and where he could, hold up his hand and the whole earth would vanish, and it was a very mind-expanding, a beautiful experience that led him to founding the Noetic Sciences Institute. And so I think that maybe it was, he just wasn't comfortable speaking of it on that level, and on your show, but I'm sure he was very affected by his experience there.
Well, one would think that that would be an experience that would be so imprinted that when you're asked for it, the way I asked about it, you would just bubble up with everything that you remembered about it. And I just wanted the easy stuff. What it felt like when you stepped, what things looked like, what you thought about while you were seeing all of this. And he just really couldn't relate it. Now, maybe it was just that interview in that moment, but it was that question and it was that answer. He said, Art, it's a funny thing. I really can't remember much about it. And I just thought that was amazing.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, what he shared with me was more this sort of effect it had on him as opposed to any sort of other details. But I do know that when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were there were UFOs that were gathered around the crater where we landed. And this is not a myth. And I've had it confirmed to me by my multiple independent folks. And one of the reasons that Neil Armstrong did not appear in public much is that he did not want to deceive through the secrecy the public on what really happened. He was very uncomfortable with that, and that's why he became kind of reclusive and gave very few public appearances during his lifetime after he landed on the moon in 1969. And I think that Buzz Aldrin, had a hard time coping with it also, and I've had members of his family confirm to me that in fact he had the same experience, but that he wasn't allowed to speak about it. And it's really unfortunate. Ironically, my uncle, who worked at Grumman and worked on the lunar module, passed away 2 weeks after Neil Armstrong did, but I think it's sort of an open secret in some circles that, in fact, when we first landed on the moon, we weren't alone. And it's certainly known through the Disclosure Project witnesses we have that when we went up there before the lunar landing, we had something called the Lunar Orbiter that went around and took the early digital photographs.
That's
and
right.
There were structures there. And Carl Wolf and other people we have in our Disclosure Project, saw at this NSA facility that was at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, these images that were clearly showing very old structures on the moon, but also some newer ones. And the structures were in the area called the terminator, which is the area between the dark and the light part of the moon. It's sort of the twilight area because the moon is sort of fixed and where it is, where you see the light side, the sun hitting one side of it. But I think that this is why when we landed on the moon, they were prepared for the possibility or the likelihood that we may not be alone. And people have asked me, did we actually go to the moon? Yes, we did. But was all the footage of what happened shown to the public? Absolutely not. It was not shown. And I do know of people who have seen that footage, who've been in these classified programs. They're not willing to come out publicly, but they've described pretty much essentially the same thing, that there were multiple huge UFOs that were flying around, but also around and hovering at the edge of the crater of the Sea of Tranquility where we landed.
And that is where we will leave Dark Matter for tonight. We will pick it up for the final in part 3 tomorrow night. Till then, of course, make sure you do like, share, and subscribe. Get us to those goals of 5,000 views, 1,000 subscribers for Boxy, Nexters, and YouTube. And it's always a great new world to release the Krakens. Have a great night, everybody.